Gretzky or McDavid? If you're a hockey fan, you know the answer to this is Wayne Gretzky. But if you're under the age of 35 and you'd like to dish out hot takes online, maybe you'd say McDavid is better than Gretzky, and you'd make the argument about the 80s era, the goaltending, the team defense, the lack of foreign players in the NHL, the watering down of talent after the WHA folded, etc. But with all that said, McDavid is currently having a historic season, averaging 1.91 points per game, on pace for around 65 goals and over 150 points. And seeing as how this is a fantasy channel and I've hardly discussed the undisputed best fantasy hockey player in the last 25 years, I figured I'd show you just how special McDavid and his incredible 22-23 season really is. Now, before we get into comparisons, let's take a look at what McDavid has done this season. At the time of recording this video, 54 goals, 70 assists, 124 points in just 66 games played. 1.91 points per game, that's incredible, and we'll get to that in just a second. 0.81 goals per game, 1.09 assists per game, averaging just a shade under 4.5 shots per game, and just a shade under 1 power play point per game, and he just set the Edmonton record for most power play points in a season. So that's a direct shot across the bow at Wayne Gretzky, who would probably have been my guess for the number one guy getting power play points in Edmonton history. So this is what he's been doing this year. Let's take a look at how that stacks up compared to everybody else who's played since Wayne Gretzky left the league. Now, when you do that, you see that Joe Thornton actually had the highest point per game season in 2005-2006. That was the year right after the lockout when the rule changes increased scoring back up to close to where they are today. You also see a couple of Jaromir Jagrs on here. You got the 99-2000 season, which is really impressive in the dead puck era. You have this season with the Rangers, 1.5 points per game. You have the suspects that you would suspect from this era, Sidney Crosby, Alex Ovechkin at the top, but the highest is 1.54. That's almost 0.35 lower than what Connor McDavid is doing right now. Now, what set me on the path to do this exercise was a tweet I saw from Paul at Adjusted Hockey showing the average save percentage by year since the mid-50s. Now, it's immediately clear by looking at this chart and from Paul's tweet on the side there that from 73 to 94, scoring was much higher than at any other point in league history. And then I thought to myself, gee, isn't that when Wayne Gretzky played? And you look at it, and this period of time from 79-80 until basically 87-88, maybe even further into the early 90s, that's Gretzky's prime. That's when he was putting up all these numbers, and you basically have AHL level save percentage this entire time. So I wondered, how does that affect scoring in general? So you look at this, and you see 100-point player seasons by decade, 113 in the 1980s. If you took the last 25 years or so and combined all of these, you wouldn't even come close to half of how many 100-point player seasons there were in the 1980s. Take a look at this chart over here. You're getting 50-goal seasons, 76 of them in the 1980s. Now, by today's standards, it's incredibly rare to find a 50-goal scorer. And this is where we get into the topic of adjusting for era-adjusted statistics. So the question I have is, how does McDavid's season in 22-23 stack up to Gretzky, specifically when you adjust for this massive increase in scoring?
The cronies might tell you that if you adjust for era, it's not.
Dude.
Yeah, and listen, that's
Dude,
where I know you'd like that one.
What does that even mean? Like, are you factoring in the goaltender's equipment and stuff back in the 80s? So how are they adjusting the goalies in the era? Like, who is factoring in that?
Because you do it based on the
numbers. Into a math equation.
Now, there's two ways you could do this. You could either take McDavid's numbers and adjust them to the 1980s, or you could take Gretzky's numbers and adjust them to today, which I thought was a much better exercise because we all know what the stats look like today. We live today, we know what the stats are, and we know what players are doing and how they're performing. So why don't we take Gretzky and convert him to 22-23 levels? So how do we do that? Very simple. 3.16 goals for per game is the pace right now in the NHL 22-23. This is the formula that I used. Gretzky's actual point per game during any given year, and then you take the difference between that given year and today's goals for per game, and you multiply that by his point per game. So, an example, 82-83 season, this is not hard to follow. I'll put arrows here so you can follow along. In 82-83, scoring was elevated 22% higher than it is today. So you take 1 minus 22.15 to get the differential, and then you multiply that by 2.45, and you get 1.907 point per game adjusted for today's levels. So that's the formula that I use to calculate Gretzky's 22-23 stats. So let's take a look at what they look like for his entire career. Now, what you see in the orange is what he actually did. 2.7 points per game, 2.69 points per game. These are incredible numbers. When you adjust them for specifically the 22-23 season, you get the blue numbers, the blue lines here, and we will just filter these out in just a second. But the difference between era adjusted and the 22-23 season adjusted is that Gretzky's production isn't changed or assumed. It's simply adapted to the entire league scoring average, totaling 3.16 goals for per game. So you get a look at exactly what Gretzky would have done had the league at that time been scoring at the pace that it is today. You're not adjusting for an entire era. You're not adjusting to 18 skaters or 82 games per season or anything else that some of these other models do. We're just looking at the scoring levels between this year and any given year during Gretzky's career. So this is how his 22-23 point per game would look compared to his actual point per game levels. But let's look at just the adjusted levels. Here's what we get when we compare McDavid to Gretzky. This line right here is McDavid's current point per game level at 1.91. Now, when you're looking at this, you can see a couple of things. First and foremost, Gretzky still has 6 seasons above McDavid's pace right now. 8 seasons at or above McDavid's pace for all intents and purposes. This 1.89 is right there. This 1.907 is right there. So 8 seasons he was at or above where Connor McDavid is right now. And that is really impressive still, because you've already adjusted for this level of scoring and he's still that much better. Number 2, at his best, Gretzky was only 0.17 points per game above McDavid's best, which is shocking when you think about it. McDavid is having a historically incredible season. Now, obviously, you could do the same exercise with Lemieux, and maybe you'd get a couple more seasons that were above McDavid's pace right now. But still, this puts him in rarefied air with some of the best, if not the only best player in the NHL's history. Now, number 4, the one thing that I wanted to look at just in terms of Gretzky, as his career winded down going to St. Louis and New York, the common conception is that his production dropped off, and while it did compared to his prime, from 95-96 until 97-98, he averaged 1.28 points per game 3 years in a row. If you put that pace into this season's leaderboard, he'd rank 10th in the league behind Jack Hughes. So that's what this graph is showing you. This is the point per game leaders, and what you can see here is obviously 2 things. One, Gretzky at 35, 36, 37 years old was still better than almost everybody in the NHL today, which is kind of crazy to think about. This is this year's top scorers over the age of 35. Crosby at 1.21 points per game is really impressive. That's another thing that I didn't really expect to see. Crosby at 35 years old is producing just a shade below what Wayne Gretzky was at the same age, which is kind of incredible when you think about it. Same thing for Claude Giroux. I mean, Crosby's a generational type of player, first overall pick. Claude Giroux was a second-round draft pick, and he's putting up 1.17 points per game, which is a little bit lower than Gretzky's, but still very impressive nonetheless. The next thing I notice is the gap between McDavid and Draisaitl, and then these guys are obviously teammates, so the gap between McDavid and the next best player not playing with him is McKinnon. That's almost 0.4 point per game difference between his pace and the next best player. So he is lapping the field much like Gretzky used to do. But let's take a look at some more Gretzky adjusted data. This is goals per game. And when you look at McDavid's goals per game pace, he's at 0.81 goals per game. Currently has 54 goals on the season at the time of creating this video. And if he kept this pace up until the end of the season, he's on pace for 66 goals. And he's outscoring all but 2 of Gretzky's seasons. 81-82, where Gretzky put up a record 92 goals, and 2 years later in 83-84, where he put up 87 goals in fewer games. Now, when you adjust for 22-23 scoring levels, those 92 goals come out to 68.88 goals, 69 goals or so. And the 87 goal season was in fewer games, so that comes out to 72.98 or around 73 goals. So just slightly out of reach for even the best modern goal scorers. But that's the insanity of Connor McDavid's season in terms of goal production this year. He's outscoring the best goal scorer that's ever lived, albeit not Ovechkin, but statistically the best goal scorer that's ever lived. But the insanity of Wayne Gretzky is in the assists. When you look at the assists, even adjusted to 22-23 levels, Gretzky is in a league of his own. So first off, Gretzky has 12 seasons at a higher assist per game pace than McDavid's 1.09. And secondly, at his best, Gretzky is 0.41 assists per game better than McDavid, which is insane to think about. He's at 1.51 assists per game by today's level, not by 80s levels. So that's an insane difference between the best assist guy in the entire NHL's history, a guy who, if he never scored a goal, would still be the all-time leading scorer in the NHL, and you're getting that much more production out of him than you would the best player in today's generation. Just something I thought was incredibly interesting. The point of this exercise isn't to bring Gretzky down or diminish his accomplishments. It's simply to provide context to the greatness we are witnessing night in and night out from Connor McDavid. One day, my sons will grow up, and maybe they'll play hockey like I did. Maybe one night while we're watching a game together, a McDavid stat or highlight will be mentioned on the broadcast, and I'll be able to turn to them and say, I saw him live. I watched him every night. What we are witnessing this season is something that only comes around once in a generation, hence the term generational talent, and Connor McDavid has absolutely lived up to that label. The speed, the quickness, the stick handling, the poise, the determination, the consistency with which he can maintain this point pace is something that we may not see again for a long time. I'm lucky enough to have watched the tail end of Gretzky's career. I saw him live. I watched his highlights growing up every single day, and I never thought I'd see anything like him again. And we may never see anyone break some of his records: 50 goals in 39 games, 215 points in a season, 92 goals in a season, his astronomical 2,857 career points. The list goes on and on. But the fact that a player today, with all of the advancements in defensive structure, analytics, skill development, off-ice training, etc., can put up numbers anywhere close to what the great one did is something we need to cherish and remember. Now, there is a lot of time left in his career, but where would you rank Connor McDavid among the all-time greats? Is he top 10 all-time? Top 5? Let me know in the comments below. Remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. It really helps me out a lot, and I appreciate every one of you taking the time to do so. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.